Okay, so first a quick question for all of you. Were any of you at PyCon this year in Chicago and saw the first version of this talk? Okay, so maybe 4 or 5 people. Well, today you are going to get the extended remix. I have 40% new slides as I do this, plus they gave me an extra half hour to talk in. So we're going to talk about how to write reusable Django applications. This really, for me, I've always felt this is the big killer feature of Django. This is the thing that we take advantage of all the time at World Online. This is the thing that I've focused on, I've written about. And I mean, I've been doing this, working with Django day in, day out now for about 2.5 years. So I'm just going to kind of be sharing some tips and some things I've accumulated as I've gone on. And they're really going to break down into about 4 main areas. The first thing, some of you may be familiar with this saying, do one thing, do it well, keep a tight focus. Second thing, don't be afraid to have multiple applications going on. You're not forced to do everything all in one gigantic module, so don't bother with it. Third thing, write your applications for flexibility. We're going to look at some specific tips for how you can build some configurability, some little dynamic stuff into your applications. And finally, build your applications to be distributed, because that really, I mean, being able to go out and grab a copy of your application, install it, drop it into my project is one of the killer features of Django. So, okay, let's go ahead and get started. First thing, probably you've seen this at some point. This is often called the Unix philosophy. Do one thing and do it well. And what you'll hear a lot of times is applications, programs written for Unix, they're supposed to take just one little task. grep is supposed to find text in a file. ls is supposed to list things in a directory. And rather than try and do all of this stuff in one program, you have a collection of little apps and just kind of plug them together. And Django is no different. I mean, this is good development advice no matter what you're doing. And in Django, it's kind of different. I like to say that an application encapsulates some particular feature. Now, that's kind of a loaded word. It comes from object-oriented programming. What we say when we talk about encapsulation, we mean that we're going to take, in object-oriented programming, we take a class, it represents some data and some logic for working with that data. So everything you need to know about that object is right there in your class. In a Django application, you can take some feature, user signups, or a contact form, or tagging, and you can encapsulate the data models that you need for that, the views you need to do for that, the URL patterns you need for that, the template tags you need for that. You can encapsulate them all into one little package just the same way. And that really is a very successful way to approach application development. You end up with this really, what I call, tight focus. And what I like to do when I'm developing an application is I like to ask myself, okay, so what is this supposed to do? And generally, the answer to that question should be 1 or maybe 2 short sentences. And just to give a couple of examples here, if you want to talk about django.contrib.auth, okay, what does it do? It handles storage of users and authentication. Okay, you want to talk about Jonathan Buchanan's Django tagging, which is one of the most insanely useful third-party applications out there. What does it do? Allows the content to be tagged to delicious style and let you query on it. Somebody wants to write a weblog. What's that going to do? Okay, handle entries in a weblog. These are really good examples of answers to this question. Then on the flip side, sometimes you'll run into people, you ask, okay, what does this application do? And you're going to get something like this, and it just keeps going and going and going, and really it reads like a run-on sentence. That's generally a warning sign that you're trying to do too much in your application. You're not staying focused. You're not staying on that one task your application should be doing. And there are definitely some major warning signs that I've run into. One of the biggest is, in my experience, a lot of the very best, most useful, reusable Django applications are small. Just a few files. Django tagging, I think, is like 12 files. A user registration application that I wrote is about 6 if you don't count the translations. I mean, really, Django lets you do a whole lot with very little code. So if your application is getting to the point where it's big enough that you really need to work hard to keep a neat, pristine sort of directory layout like what you normally see in an application, that might be a sign that you've gone overboard, you're trying to do too much, and it's time to kind of step back, reevaluate what you're doing, and say, am I staying on my application's focus? Another warning sign I see a lot of times is even if you're looking at a really simple site, like I run a weblog. My weblog has 13 applications in its installed apps list. And that's literally just for entries, links, categories, tagging, a contact form, and an about page. I have 13 applications installed for that. So if you've got a really complex site and you're only looking at a couple of applications in your installed apps list, again, this may be a sign that you're doing too much at once, all in one application, and maybe you need to again step back, rethink whether these are focused enough, whether you're keeping that sort of tight one thing and one thing well. So I want to look at a case study, just kind of give an example of this. Some of you may have used this site, djangosnippets.org, where people can put up little snippets of code and share them. When I released this, put this up live, I needed some way for people to be able to sign up and fill out a form like this. And so I wrote a little user registration application. And it has a feature list, basically goes like this. You fill out the form, you get an inactive account, you get an email with a link that you click to activate your account, and that's it. That's what this application does. And really, when you think about it, I mean, it seems like user registration is such a simple thing, and we're going to get into how to deal with some of this, but really, you start looking at it, different sites, okay, I want your username and your password and an email address because that's all I need. But, this guy over here, his marketing department wants to know if they can sign you up for their newsletter. And this guy over here needs your zip code and all this stuff. So you've got all these different workflows immediately. People are going to want to have different types of users. People are going to want to have different types of sign-up processes. And it's going to go on and on and on. So even though you may kind of laugh at it and say, well, it's just user registration. It's just really simple. Turns out some simple things aren't so simple. How many of you have read an essay by Neil Stephenson called "In the Beginning Was the Command Line"? Very good. He's got this section in there where he really kind of makes this point really well. He's talking about Emacs, and he's comparing it to Microsoft Word and the focus that Emacs has on editing plain text. And he says the man-hours of work that in the case of Word were dedicated to embedding full-length motion pictures in corporate memos, in Emacs were focused on the simple task of editing plain text. And really, you're going to run into this all the time. Things that seem like they should be simple, things that seem like they should be easy, are going to turn out not really to be either one of those. And when you run into that, you're going to be glad that you stayed tightly focused. Of course, this does lead you to really having sort of a skeptical mindset anytime people want to suggest a feature. What I usually do is I go through sort of an internal checklist of questions. Every time I get a feature request, I say, okay, what does my application do? I know my answer to that. It's just a short sentence. So this feature that I'm being asked for, what does it have to do with my application? And a lot of times, turns out, nothing whatsoever. So a real example, for a long time, the top feature request in my user registration app was the ability to fill out a user profile at sign-up time and go back and edit that and configure what fields are we going to ask for in the profile and all that sort of thing. And my response to that really was, okay, what does that have to do with user registration? And the answer is almost nothing at all. So I ended up saying, no, I'm not going to add this feature to Django registration. However, I did come up with a solution that made a lot of people happy. I wrote a second application, which I called django-profiles, and it has a feature list. This feature list is you can add a profile, you can edit your profile, you can view your profile, and that's all it does. Again, keeping a tight focus, I released it, and people are happy. So what we ended up with was two applications, which really kind of leads into this idea, this next big thing. Okay, you're going to focus on one thing at a time. One application does one thing, encapsulates one feature, which means you're going to have to learn to live with lots of applications. Now, this is something that I've run into. I used to do PHP and Perl professionally before I came to Django. I've played with some of the other Python frameworks. I'd used Rails very briefly. And a lot of them all have what I call the monolith mindset, which really, the more I've used Django, the more it kind of bothers me and the more I want to get away from this. What you end up doing is you end up taking one application and equating it to my application is my site. And so it has to have all of the features that my site is going to have. And I mean, we've already looked at some of the problems with focus, but this really makes reuse and reusability and repackaging almost into an afterthought. And so what you end up with instead is lots of plugins that hook into your main system, or you start using middleware or other concepts like that every time you need to try to add new features, because you've ended up with such this gigantic monolithic system that you can't necessarily separate things out or add things in easily. By contrast, Django really wants you to use these sort of reusable applications. Django definitely says an application is going to be some particular piece of functionality on your site, and definitely says your site is going to be several applications. Most of the time, you don't really have a choice with that because of the way Django's set up. And so what you end up doing is spinning off lots of new applications. And I mean, again, really, instead of one application in Django, you end up with an installed apps list. Instead of what you run into in some frameworks where you have a specific directory where you put your applications or your plugins, Django applications live directly on the Python path. Django comes out of the box with abstractions like the site model. So you can go in and tie things to sites and make you think about multiple deployments, multiple installations, almost as soon as you start writing code. So really, from the get-go, Django is trying to get you into this mindset. And so again, I have a little checklist that I walk through anytime I'm thinking about splitting off applications. I say, okay, should whatever I'm thinking about be its own application? Well, is it completely unrelated to whatever I'm focusing on with this application? If that's the case, then yeah, I'll split it off. Is it orthogonal to whatever else I'm doing? And we'll talk about that in just a second. Or will I need similar functionality on some other site? Could I see myself reusing this, needing this feature somewhere else? If the answer to any of these, any one of these questions is yes, then I'm going to go ahead and split this off. So a lot of times you'll run into, for example, unrelated features. And it really is tempting because you'll end up thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great if I just had this one thing? But trust me, as someone who's been down that road, and I think we've all been down that road, it really, I mean, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Feature requests are an example of that. And again, we've been over that one in detail. So I'd like to talk about sort of a personal failure on my part. Going back to the example of djangosnippets.org. This has really all of the code sharing and everything that you deal with outside of user sign-up is one application. It includes the bookmarking features. It includes its tagging system. It includes its rating features. This bothers me to this day because it really should have been 4 different applications. And if any of you have looked at it, I went out and I wrote a book telling people not to do what I did. If you have a copy, page 210 will tell you why that should have been 4 different applications and not one. Anyway, getting back to this little checklist of questions, the next thing I usually ask is orthogonality. And this is really kind of a tricky word. It was a long time before I even understood it. Basically boils down to I can change one thing in my application or one feature without affecting the way other features are going to work. And whenever something is orthogonal, you almost always I mean, almost always, I've never yet run into a case where it shouldn't be a separate application. And so going back to my example of the user profiles, changing the fields in a user profile or changing the workflow for filling in your custom profile and telling us, where do you live and uploading your avatar. I can change that and have no effect whatsoever on how people sign up for accounts, which says this should be a separate application. And, again, generally you run into cases where you say, well, I want to reuse this. I had this great idea for a feature, but I don't really see this being specific to the site, bookmarks and tagging and ratings and all this stuff that you have to come with this djangosnippets.org code sharing application just to get them. So maybe look at a more successful case study. Let's talk about blogging. How many of you have written a blog with Django? Okay, once again, this is kind of the rite of passage. I've done this 3 times now. The last time I did it, I said I wanted a blog, and I had this big old feature list of stuff that I wanted. I wanted entries and links and tagging and moderation and all of this. And I could have gone with one gigantic application, and in fact, originally, a couple of years ago, that's what I had. But I ended up with 13 different applications. Admin, auth, flat pages, comments, comment moderation, tagging, blog entries and links, content types, syndication, and there are 4 more, but I can't remember off the top of my head what they are right now. But believe me, I have 13 applications installed there. And really ended up with a whole bunch of flexibility. Because now, whenever I have one of these features, I don't have to rewrite it. I can just take it, plug it into a new site whenever I want it. My canonical example is a contact form. Everybody wants to have a contact form so you can get in touch with them. I ended up writing a contact form application, and now when I want it, that's what I do. That, to me, is the advantage of being able to spin off these applications, because that's all I have to do. Now, I know some people are going to raise a question, and we've already talked about this a little bit earlier on when I pointed out even a simple thing like registration, or in this case, a contact form, isn't necessarily as simple as you're going to think it is. When I was writing my contact form, this came up. Okay, I'm going to have these different needs. One site, just wants an email address and a message, and they're done. But that other guy over there, he's got that pesky marketing department. They want to know, how much money do you make, how many people are in your household, that kind of thing. Another site has been getting all kinds of automatic spam. They want to use a Kismet to filter their contact form. How are we going to do that and still keep this tightly focused, spinning off features as we need them kind of mindset? And the answer to that, as I've discovered over a long and laborious process of working through these types of things, is simply being able to write flexible code. And I really do mean flexible. And a lot of it is really just coming down to common sense. People will talk about this. Lots of projects strive for this. Sane defaults, easy overrides. As much as possible, and this is my key point here, don't set anything in stone. I've talked about this. I've given this talk once before. I've posted some examples of this on my blog. I've done this in my book. This kind of thing is really, in fact, when you get into it, almost easier than doing it the wrong way. Let's take a look at some examples. Form processing. So you want to have a view that processes a form. So you're going to need to have a form class that you can work with. So go ahead and supply one, but let people specify their own. And kind of the canonical way that's come up to do this is, okay, I'm going to define my default form class. I'm going to define my view, but I'm going to take an argument in my view that lets you say which form to use. I'll default it to mine, and then just refer to that. And now anybody who wants to can use your view and plug in any form class they want. As long as it's following Django's form processing API, it'll work. You can do the same thing with templates. You got to have, for a view, you probably want to have a default template that you're going to use in the absence of customization. But again, let people specify their own. Generic views do this. A lot of views built into Django do this. And again, it's just an argument. Usually people go with template name, take that and refer to it. Another aspect of form processing, a lot of times people want to redirect after a submission. So, okay, we'll supply a default URL, and we'll let people specify what they want to do afterwards. Contrib auth does this. Generic views do this. And again, you can take an argument. Usually you'll see people calling it success URL and just redirect afterwards. Now, this really isn't a lot of code. I mean, you can notice we've built up that example as we've gone. That's still very readable. That's still very simple. But now, you can plug in any form you want, any combination of fields you want, use any template you want to render it, and go anywhere you want to send somebody after they've successfully filled it out. That is a simply incredible amount of flexibility, considering that it's like 5 lines of code. And when you start building applications this way, well, now let's take our contact form example. The guy who needs a form that takes, how many people live in your household and how much money do you make? Okay, he'll fill in a form class and he'll fill in a template name. Somebody who wants to use Akismet filtering can write a little bit of validation on his own form, plug it in, still keep the default template. There are all sorts of use cases just from this little bit of code that we're now flexible enough to handle. And really, that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Another thing that usually comes up is people want to do URLs. A lot of good applications come with their own URL conf, give you some default patterns to route things. Generally, what I like to do is always use a named pattern, and this is the killer feature: use reverse lookups. Use the reverse function, use the permalink decorator, use the URL tag, because now, again, for just a tiny amount of code, the flexibility you get, okay, I want to use whatever view this is, but I want a different URL. I set up a URL with the right name and point to your view, and now everything in your code that used that named pattern still works. I can plug in pretty much anything I want, anywhere I want in my URL hierarchy, and not have to rewrite any of this code. Again, it's just an insane amount of flexibility. And the deeper you dig, the more of this stuff you'll find in Django. I did a couple of blog posts last year talking about models and sort of generically getting at models. I like to say, whenever you can, avoid hard coding model classes in code that you're writing to be reused. Django provides this really incredibly handy function called getModel, which you pass it a pair of items, an application name and a model name, and it will go out and fetch the model class for you and then let you work with it. And once you've got it, a lot of times I like to say, don't rely on objects being that manager that Django creates for you. Django actually provides a hook for this, so that if you wanted to write, say, a generic function that takes any, in this case, we're going to get any object by primary key from any model you have installed. What we're going to do is just use getModel, and we're going to use the default manager hook. And if you look at the result there, I've done this sort of generic lookup code about 4 or 5 different times now. We've got some stuff like that in Ellington, which is the CMS we distribute. I've got some stuff like that in my personal projects. I've got an application I've released that's open source that provides template tags to do this sort of thing. And it all gets away with never having to hard code anything about your model, because Django gives you these incredibly flexible APIs to go fetch a model, find out what its default manager is, go querying against it, any set of arguments. And you can really take this as far as you want to. You can introspect on a model class or on a model object to get the names of its fields, get the names of the database table it's using, get the names of many-to-many join tables it's using. All of that information is in there. You can take dictionaries of lookup arguments, and because the API works the same, you can pass them directly on into the database API and never have to worry about hard coding lookups. One of my favorite tricks with models, by the way, is managers. I love managers because they let you encapsulate this sort of thing. Managers are reusable. How many of you have written a custom manager? Very good. Managers, I love the way they're reusable because you can take whatever logic you want, okay, drop it onto the model you designed it for, and then, well, okay, I want it on this other model too, so I'll give that model one of these managers. And I want it on this model, so I'll give that model one of these managers. I love the fact that you can subclass them, you can customize them, change the behaviors, encapsulate patterns of behavior behind a really nice API. In the book and in a couple of examples that I've posted publicly, I go through taking really complex queries and turning them into manager methods with really short names. I love turning them into things like something.objects.getTopRated, and it ends up doing a query that's this long. But all I have to remember to type is getTopRated. This really is just one of the most powerful patterns Django's going to give you. And again, you can keep going. You can get into designing things and encouraging them to be subclass. When I wrote my contact form application, that's really the approach that I took. Was I said, okay, here's a base contact form, here's the methods on it, here are the attributes on it. If you want to change the behavior, subclass it, and I've given you the hooks for this. Or if you look at things like Django's database backends, or session backends, or file storage backends, you can say, okay, here's an interface, implement this, and my code will work with it. And that's why you can go now. There are people externally maintaining MS SQL Server backend for Django. There are people already writing Amazon S3 backends to let you upload files from Django straight there and avoid the file system, because the file storage system will happily take anything that implements its interface. You can set up things that use registries. The admin does this. You go in, you register your model admin subclass with the admin site. Django tagging does this now. You can register a model to be taggable. My old comment moderation application did this. It's now a little bit out of date because the comments got refactored, but part of that actually incorporated some of the ideas of saying, okay, I want comment moderation. Well, I'll write a class that does that and register it to be moderated. And really, the more you think about this, and the more you look at all of these things Django offers to let you write these sort of flexible, dynamic, reusable applications, the more you realize how much this comes down to having a good API. And I really want to hammer this home, because to me, this is just, I can't express this strongly enough. The API you end up writing as part of your application that it exposes to other applications to use is just as important, and in fact, is more important than the design of the site you're going to use it in. Your ability to take these applications, mix them and match them, plug them together, change the behavior, stay flexible, that's what's going to make or break you. That's what we've been doing for years now at World Online, where we talk about Ellington, and you hear about Ellington as a CMS. Ellington is actually a collection of a couple dozen applications that we sell in different configurations of, oh, okay, this is the type of publication you're doing, here's the set of applications you use. Okay, you're doing that kind of publication, here's this set of applications. And that ability to mix and match, I mean, I don't even know what it is now. When I started working there, it was $30,000 a pop for a license. That's pretty good money for just mixing and matching a set of applications. And it all comes from putting in the hard work, and it is hard work, and it's a lot of hard work, to do good API design up front so you can start doing those types of use cases. So I'm just going to go over a couple examples, things that I've run into, real-world applications, real-world sites I've worked with. I'm not going to name any names. Probably my favorite API ever is pass a value for this argument, and it changes. I will point out Django does this all over the place in some of its built-in views. Another good example is change the value of this setting, and you change the behavior of the application. Satchmo, when we were talking about that a little while ago, Satchmo does this, has a lot of custom settings. You can do a whole lot to Satchmo without ever touching the code, just by changing settings. I love that about it. Another good example is subclass this, override some methods. You see that in the admin, to take an example. Subclass model admin, or even subclass admin site, and override the methods. Implement something with the right interface, plug it in. These are all really good examples of API design. And unfortunately, I've also seen some examples of really bad API design, some of the worst offenders I've ever seen. And this one is actually from an email with someone I was communicating with less than a week ago. API, let me see if we have one of those. If you have this, you don't have a flexible, reusable application. You don't have an API. You really don't have much of anything. Another response I've gotten is, it's open source. Fork it. Do whatever you want. That's really saying, you know, screw you. Go away. We don't want to deal with you. And this one's going to get me lynched. This is the signature of a WSGI application. This is not an API. This is a web service. Which, you know, it may be useful as a web service, but it's not an API for your application. It's a gateway interface. And I know sometimes we get knocked on as a framework for not really supporting WSGI as much as we could, or not being as thoroughbred WSGI as we could. I personally can live with that, because the more I deal with it, the more I think WSGI gets overused in place of genuine APIs, and I'd rather force people to actually think about this stuff. So, but anyway, these sorts of API choices all really go into building a flexible application, which once you have it, okay, we're tightly focused, we're spinning things off, we've built for flexibility. What's the last thing we've got to do? Well, we've got to be able to distribute this. And some of you are going to recognize this is my personal soapbox. You do the django-project.com tutorial, and you learn how to work with Django, and you end up with a lot of code that looks like this. You're going to see mysite.polls.models, mysite.polls.views, mysite.polls.urls. You have a project name hard-coded everywhere in your application. Project coupling like this kills reuse. You do not want this kind of coupling. What you end up with is what I say, projects suck, because you end up having to replicate the directory structure of your project, or you end up having to do all sorts of tricky bits with your Python path, and you end up getting back into that monolithic mindset of, I'm developing one thing that has all of the features. Meanwhile, the very few instances that I've seen of good use of projects, it's just a settings module, a root URL conf module, and nothing else. That's all you have to have a project, is settings and root URLs. And if you start adopting this way of developing, you suddenly open up a lot of advantages. You're no longer making assumptions about where my code is going to be, what code am I going to have available, no tricky bits. You're really remembering that a Django project is just another Python module. And in fact, doesn't even have to be one module. If you were to look at how we do it at the journal world, ljworld.com actually doesn't have a project. I'm simplifying the Python path a little bit, but what you end up with is worldonline.settings.ljworld. That's settings for ljworld.com. worldonline.urls.ljworld. That's the root URL configuration for ljworld.com. And then we have a whole bunch of applications that we reuse over and over and over again, which can now go into logical, sensible locations based on what they're doing. So I like to harp on this. Reusable applications tend to be either one single module that lives directly on a Python path. Example is Django tagging. You end up with a module named tagging. Or a bunch of related modules living under a single package. This is what we do with Ellington. We have a bunch of applications in Ellington that all live under that namespace, and then we just mix and match them. But none of this project cruft. You never, ever, ever want to have a project name involved. You never want to have to put an application inside your project. And really, now it's incredibly easy. You can use the standard Python tools, distutils, and setup tools, make packages, put them on the cheese shop. People can type easy install and get your application, and it's just incredibly simple. So let's talk about, okay, we're going to take this application, we're going to package it up. What am I going to have to do? First thing, and I mention this first because it is most important, is be upfront about dependencies. If you use setup tools, Setup tools lets you specify this. Setup tools lets you talk about, okay, what am I depending on? Like I've got a blog application. Requires about 6 different other Django applications. If I use setup tools, I can tell it, okay, I want Django tagging at least this version. I want, contact form at least this version. Get everything installed. This one's a little controversial, and as we go forward, especially toward Python 2.6 and Python 3, it's going to get a little less important. I still write for Python 2.3. Django officially supports 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, and we will support 2.6 when it's released. I like to write applications that will run anywhere Django will run. So that's what I do. And pick a release or pick trunk and document it. But if you pick trunk, update frequently. Now, a lot of this isn't as important anymore since we have 1.0. We have a stable, guaranteed API-compatible platform. But for example, the Satchmo guys, I was on the mailing list these past couple months, setting up a Satchmo store, watching, trying to stay up to date. If you're going to track trunk, you have to do that. I would say if you're going to follow trunk at least once a week, you need to SVN up and make sure your application still runs. If you don't, just pick a release and pin to it. And again, that's going to be easier now that we've got 1.0. We're on a 1.0 series where you can just say, okay, future releases aren't going to break me. I'm not going to talk too much about templates as far as packaging because templates are really hard. It's a big out-of-the-box win if you can ship default templates with an application, but they're almost impossible to make truly portable. Everybody wants to have a different block structure, a different inheritance structure, different tag libraries installed. So just when I'm packaging an application, I generally don't do any default templates. I made that mistake with Django registration. When I first shipped that out, it came with default templates. And about 60% of the bugs during the period when I had those, about 60% of the bug reports that came in were people saying, your default templates don't work with my site. So I gave up on that pretty quickly. Either way, document your template names, document your template contexts. And in fact, as long as you're at it, be obsessive about documentation. Don't just document those. It's Python. You can give everything a doc string. If you do, Django will generate very nice documentation for you in the admin. The people can go and browse and see everything you have installed and how it works. And your users and your developers, I promise, will love you. There is nothing that I like more than installing an application, going to the admin, pulling up the documentation, and being able to read through, okay, here are the models it provides, here are the views it provides, here are the template tags it provides, seeing what all of these things do. And I get into this habit where I tend to write documentation first. And I've kind of adopted this from, there's a saying in the Zen of Python, where it says, if the implementation is hard to explain, it's a bad idea. If the implementation is easy to explain, it may be a good idea. I tend to follow this to an extreme as I'm writing documentation. And I don't know if any of you have listened to This Week in Django this week. We talked a little bit about what we call documentation-driven development, where I take it to the point where I even write the doc strings before I write the code. I rewrite the doc strings before I refactor my code. I write doc tests, or at least I'm trying to get into the habit of writing doc tests, every time I write a doc string. And as far as a packageable, distributable application, this is a huge advantage because now you know you are never going to lack for documentation. Your documentation's always going to be up to date. And going back to the Zen of Python, if something's hard to explain, it's a bad idea. It's easier to throw out a doc string than it is to throw away a whole bunch of code you just wrote. And if you follow these practices, Django really will help you. It'll let you use restructured text formatting in your doc strings. It'll read it. It'll do nice HTML generation for you. It gives you extra directives you can use for cross-referencing to models and views and templates and URLs that you want to refer to. So really, as much as possible, document everything you can think of. I mean, PEP 8 says every public module, class, and function should have a docstring. I don't take it quite that far, but I'd say maybe 80% of them should. I'm also a little bit weird in that I once wrote a module that was 800 lines of 800 lines long and only about 200 lines of code. The other 600 were documentation, so take that with a grain of salt. But if you do, remember Django will help you, and this will make your application easier for other people to pick up and run with and reuse. So let's run back over these real quick. My 4 big points here. Do one thing, do it well. Keep your tight focus. Avoid feature creep. Ask yourself every time you add a feature, how is this related? Should this go in this application? Don't be afraid to. When the answer is no, this doesn't belong in my application. Don't be afraid to spin it off and write a new one. Always, as you're writing, keep in mind flexibility, maintaining a good API, making it easy for people to reach in and customize and change the behavior. And finally, build a distributable application that people can package and just toss up, use setup tools, use easy install. And just to kind of hammer home why this is important. Way back, 2005, Django was released. And there was Django, and there was Ellington, which we'd written. And there were a couple of open source applications, not really a whole lot of activity. And it feels like PyCon 2007. A couple people presented or announced. I put up Django registration. Mr. Tauber back there, I believe that was when he kicked off his Hot Club development. There were a couple other people who did lightning talks showing off Django applications. And it was just sort of like an explosion after that. So remember, that's PyCon 2007. We're just kind of getting started. DjangoCon 2008. If you go right now to Google Code Hosting and search for Django, you will find 848 projects. DjangoSites.org is going to list 1,636 sites. And that's just what we know about so far. That's 848 applications that are out there ready-made for you to drop in and use from day one with Django. That, to me, is the killer feature, is I can go out there, I've got authentication, I've got tagging, I've got sign up, I've got OpenID, I've got a Twitter application, I've got a wiki, I've got voting, I've got rating, I've got bookmarks. Anything you can imagine, there's probably a Django application out there that will at least get you started on it, which is why following these sorts of best practices really is absolutely essential, because this is the thing that, to me, sets Django apart from every other framework I've ever used, every other development platform I've ever used, is just that abundance of really good applications. So as you're developing your own applications, remember, this is what makes them useful. This is what makes Django a killer platform. And I've still got some great examples. I don't think Jonathan Buchanan is here, but his tagging application, it's like the reference model for how to do this right. Mr. Tauber back there also wrote a nice little self-contained AtomPub application. You can go searching for Django on code hosting sites. We've got Django Hot Club now, which does huge lists of applications and Pinax, which you're going to hear about later on at the conference. Lots of reusable applications. We've got packaging that came out of a Summer of Code project. Brian Veloso has a Django pluggables site, which I love for its interface, which lets you not only see what's out there, but actually even follows their Subversion commit histories as people write the applications. So there's definitely a lot of information out there besides just this sort of talk. And if you're interested in it, I do recommend listening to James when he gives his Pinax talk a little later on. And we're at about 43 minutes out of my hour. So I'm going to stop, and that should give us about 15 for questions. Am I correct, Ms. Session Manager? Okay.
Two questions. First is about namespace. When you mentioned naming your name URLs, they're global for the most part. So
unfortunately.
I have to start prepending my app name and stuff. The same happens with fixtures. which actually is helpful because I don't write my apps very well. In my test I load fixtures from other stuff, but and then what are your comments on that?
As far as fixtures, generally I just try to give them a sensible name based on what's in the fixture. URL patterns, I actually have kind of a little trick that I do, is with a URL pattern I always give it a name consisting of the application name, the model I'm working with, and the action it will take. So like I have a blog application named Coltrane, which has an entry model. So I have a Coltrane entry detail is the name of a URL pattern for that application. And that generally has been all I've needed to avoid any kind of collisions. So I recommend, you don't have to use that particular way of doing it, but something like that ends up with a unique based on what this view is and what it's doing. So that's generally how I approach it.
The next question had to do with, you show an example when you were writing a function for a generic model, and then you use underscore default manager and stuff. Now, my understanding of Python coding practices, variables that start with a single underscore should be private. And I know I've gone through models underscore meta and instance and all that good stuff. But I know that, well, these are supposedly private and they can change at any time.
They could. Historically, in Django, they haven't really. If you were watching Adrian's talk earlier about the old days of the Django database API, actually some of the stuff in meta hasn't changed since like Django 0.91 days, when you consider how much else has changed. There is definitely a danger, and you are using something that is technically a private internal API, but at the same time it's there and it does exactly what's needed, and it's been stable for several years, so I rely on it. I write production code that relies on it. So I would say go ahead and go with it.
I've got two short questions as well. The first one is just because of my curiosity. You showed us you've got some World Online module where you've got your settings.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, do you have it installed in site packages?
It's not in site packages. It is in a directory that's on the Python path for Apache, however.
Okay, great, thanks. And the second one, you encouraged us about using registering, like in admin application. I'd like to ask you, where should we register?
Generally, it's a pattern that I look at anytime there are going to be a lot of variations on a common theme. So for example, with the admin, there are going to be a lot of different variations on list, add, and edit these objects. So you maintain a single global instance that knows how to apply sets of rules. In this case, okay, what fields, what query set, what permissions, and register with them. Another place Django uses that is template tags. You register template tags as part of a library, which you then register with Django, and now it knows where your template tags are. Another case where I've used it is I wrote an application that did comment moderation, and again, there's this idea of sort of variations on a theme. There's a global comment moderating class, and you write a subclass which expresses some rules about how to moderate, and register that with the global moderator so it knows, okay, for this model, here's the set of rules I'm using. And really, anytime you have that sort of, it's the same underlying task, but the details are different, I think a registry approach with classes or something else that implements a set of rules saying, here's how you approach the task for this instance, I think is a really useful pattern and incredibly flexible because you can just go plugging things in.
Okay. I know you wrote the admin auto-discovering into URLs, admin auto-discover to look for the models, but when new forms admin went into trunk? Or maybe you not, but I just would like if it is the best approach to
it's definitely
to call
the easiest
registering function in
Yeah.
URLs.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the easiest approach. Although, as people have found out, if you do try to auto-discover things, you sometimes end up auto-discovering them multiple times, which isn't always so handy. But, I mean, as long as you're careful about it, and that's really a case where you need to know how Python's import mechanisms work, but you can generally work around that and avoid running into that too often.
Thanks.
So I want to start out by saying, first of all, I really love the whole reusable apps idea. I think it's great. The thing is, though, in a practical sense, I feel like there's a lot of points at which having so many spread out pieces of functionality can lead to a site that at the end feels kind of disparaged and like completely separate. So how do you kind of ensure at least the UI kind of consistency across all these apps, and kind of like to keep a consistent feel for your users? Can you like say a few words about that?
Well, I think the underlying problem there is really slightly different. The underlying problem is that good user interface design is really hard. I've been fortunate enough in my day job, I work with some incredibly talented people who are very good at designing consistent usable interfaces. And that's a case where the best advice I have is to say, don't trust yourself. I don't trust myself to design user interface. I go out when I need that, I go out and I ask Nathan Borer or Jeff Croft, who I've worked with, or Christian or one of the other designers on our staff. I say, okay, I need to come up with a way to make this work. I generally defer to people who have specialized knowledge of that, because I can't even begin to approach user interface design with enough competency to try and make it work, which again goes back to I don't provide templates, and as much as possible I don't try to dictate interface because I know better.
So you're saying so you package up all these applications, these, like you said, like 13 applications, and then they just provide kind of the core functionality, and then you give the features that they provide to the UI designers to then implement all those pieces.
Well, the way I look at it is those applications are going to provide your back end and then are going to at least make some suggestions about default template names, but it's going to be up to your UI designer to decide, and really needs to be working with you as you're choosing the applications. I mean, you want UI design up front and at every step of the process. Really should be working with you from that point and saying, okay, here's how we're going to tie things together. Here's what we're going to need to be able to override and change things, and sort of build it out that way. I mean, I really think you should at least settle on your UI ideas before you've even chosen your final set of applications.
All right, thanks.
Okay, I'm a little concerned about one thing I didn't hear too much about, which was testing. And it seems like if an app's going to be reusable and easily understood by someone who's coming in from the first time, who's never used that app and wants to pull it into their project, that if they can look at a nice series of very small unit tests as well as larger integration and functional tests, that would be a great characteristic of something.
Yeah, and it's definitely, it's something that I need to add to the next version of this talk before I give it again. Mm-hmm. My coworker, Eric Holscher, is he in here? Eric? I guess not. Eric actually wrote a really brilliant tool just a couple of weeks ago that's a plugin management command that lets you start the Django development server and just go browsing around your site, and records a log of your browsing session in a format that the Django test client can use and read as a unit test. And I really think building those kinds of systems that let you automate that is the key to getting really good testing. And I'm more of a doc test fan myself. Because I love documentation, but definitely testing and being able to look at and see, okay, how do all the parts fit together? It's also something to be careful with, because it will expose odd quirks. Like right now we have buildbot failures because you can't run the Django test suite simultaneously in two separate instances without hitting a race condition in some file code. So it can also expose some odd quirks. of, well, maybe I can't use the application like this unintentionally. But yeah, definitely focus on testing. Russ has written a lot of very good documentation on testing. The testing framework in 1.0 is world-class. Like I said, we got people, Eric building tools, and just all sorts of other utilities for building up a very good test suite to go with your application. But yeah, I would definitely say focus on that. I'm more on sort of high-level interface, high-level design principles of applications. But yeah, down at the nitty-gritty, you want tests.
Just follow up. You described the tool that would run through and be able to build your suite that then can be put into the test runner.
Yeah.
So that definitely describes a very large integration test, which could be brittle. If small things change, it could fail.
Yeah.
Is there a project, or maybe the tagging one? I haven't used that. Is that a good example, or are there ones that you could point to that have good small tests? Like developing
honestly,
unit tests, test-driven.
Honestly, I would say probably look at Satchmo. They've done some incredible stuff up to and including being able to verify all of their external dependencies from management commands. I would say take a look at that because they really have some of the best integration of not just the testing system, but being able to bring in, like you've got fixtures that you can load for not only testing, but base data for localization and everything. I would say look at how they've done that because they've really done a bang-up job.
I've got a bit of a two-parter. It's part of it is a question. The other one's more of a community request, I guess. The first question is about reusability for views. I found kind of painfully when I started, delving into making separate apps for one of the projects we work on, that it was really hard to kind of come up with a generic view. Well, not a generic view in the real generic view sense, but like a view that would be generic enough that I could include it in an app, but then still be customizable enough that I could use it somewhere else. I think you touched on some of it because there was filtering that I had to do for, say, an educational site where you have a certain calendar of events. Those calendar of events need to be filtered by school. The problem was I could easily have calendar events and views that populate that, but then actually adding the school filtering was a lot more difficult. Like it's almost impossible to take a view, which is basically input-output, and somehow interfere with that and get the filtering out of it. At least not that I could think of at the time. So
well, there is a trick to it. It's more, in my experience, it comes more easily to people who have at least a little bit of a functional programming background because it really you can do sort of function composition with Django views. If you look at like generic views where they take an argument for the query set, that means if you want to route a URL, say to your own view that reads some parameter out of the URL, filters a query set, then just calls a generic view with that query set, you can do that because you have first-class functions and you can kind of compose things that way. That's the approach I would probably take, is look at, can I parameterize this enough that a wrapper view around it can figure out what to do and then call the real view.
Right, yeah, because what I found was I basically just had to rewrite the entire view down in the sort of project level, and I wound up having 10 different applications, but then I also had just as many views down at the project level, basically acting as glue code to do the refiltering that I needed at the time. So
generally that's either I take that approach because usually the wrapper ends up being 2 or 3 lines of code, or Joseph Cockerhans has proposed once or twice doing generic views as classes. Which would let you subclass them and then instantiate them and route things to them, which is another approach, a little more complicated and a little more non-traditional, but definitely something to look into.
Because it's one of those things where you could have a pre and post save or a pre and post run kind of thing. Yeah, that's what.
And that's kind of what the admin does already. A model admin is basically a set of views that also happens to be a class and has hooks for that sort of thing.
Okay, well, that answers my question then, but the request is basically, when I was trying to figure this stuff out, and I say it was painful because I basically had to figure it all out myself and under a deadline and stuff like that, but a lot of this going from the monolithic to sort of pluggable apps that all sit side by side as siblings, it'd be great if that sort of thing could be sort of video documented, like screencasted or something. There's really actually not a lot of documentation that I could find anyway at the time on doing it, and that was probably the only real caveat I ran into, was not knowing what the best way to do it or what a good way of starting to do it. So I had to just guess. So.
Well, you've got, once again, I will defer to Mr. Tauber, who's back there, running Pinax, which literally is a collection of applications designed to sit side by side, and documenting how to do that as they go. So I would say go listen to him talk and get involved with his project, because they're definitely working on that right now.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. All right, thank you.